Historical background. Ancient Greek art proper emerged during the 8th century before Common Era, 700 to 800, as things calmed down around the Aegean. About this time, iron was made into weapons, tools. People started using an alphabetic. The first Olympic Games took place 776. A complex religion emerged, and a loose sense of cultural identity grew up around the idea of Hellas, Greece. By about 700, kingdom began to be replaced by oligarchs and city-states. However, early forms of Greek art were largely confined to ceramic pottery, as the religion suffered continued disruption from widespread famine. Forced immigration. Many Greeks left the mainland to colonize towns as Asia Minor and Italy, and social unrest. This restricted the development of architecture and most other types of art, not until about 650, when maritime trade links were re-established between Greece and Egypt, as well as Anatolia, did Greek prosperity finally return and facilitate an upsurge of Greek culture. Greek art characteristics. Greek art is a broad and interesting subject. Its main features and characteristics are as follows. First is use as aesthetic idealism to give perfect vision. Second is its work have both proportionality and balance. Third is its base on anthropocentrism. Fourth is they manifest nature as an idealized form full of simplicity and proportion, clarity, and unity. Fifth is their knowledge of anatomy was broad. Six is the gods Zeus and Athena stood out all the times. There have the four stages: the geometric stage, archaic stage, classical stage, and Hellenistic stage. Geometric period. The oldest style of truly Greek art is a geometric, a period lasting roughly from 900 to 600 BC. This era saw the development of the powerful Greek cities, signaling the rise of classical Greek civilization. The geometric period in art is characterized by use and a high use of geometric shapes, particularly in vases. Vases were a major form of art geometric period. As Greek cities began trading across the Mediterranean, their vases became a major trade commodity, and artists spent more and more time decorating them. Vases of the geometric period were covered in geometric designs, abstract and ornamental designs with little or no narrative function. This period also saw another artistic change, the return of human figures. For years, Greek art did not feature many human figures, but in the geometric period, people began to reappear among the geometric patterns. However, their appearance was largely abstract, and human figures were also composed of basic geometric shapes. Archaic period. The Archaic period occurred with the onset of the Greek Olympic Games in 776 BC, which is often noted as which is period truly started. Politically and socially, this period also saw the start of the city-state, referred to as polis, which means city in Greek. These polis were mainly ruled under tyranny, although there is also debate that this tyrannical rule was not the same as what it became in later years. tyrants essentially assisted communities to become more expensive in wealth and work opportunities. Archaic Greek pottery, the most developed art form of the pre-archaic period, 900 to 650, was undoubtedly Greek pottery, often involving large vessels and other vessels. Geometric pottery includes some of the finest Greek artworks, with vases typically made according to a strict system of proportions. The new idiom featured a wider repertoire of motifs such as curvilinear designs as well as a host of composite creatures like sphinx, griffins, and chimeras. During the archaic era itself, decorations became more and more figurative as more animals, zooforms, and the human figures themselves were included. Archaic Greek architecture. It was during 16th and 17th centuries that stone was used for Greek public buildings, petrification, especially temples. Greek architecture relied on a simple post and lintel building techniques. Arches were not used until the Roman era. Greek architects were the first to base the architectural design on the standard of proportionality. To do this, they introduced their classical orders, a set of design rules based on proportions between individual parts, such as the ratio between the width and height of a column. There were the three such orders in early Greek architecture, which is Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. Greek architecture continued to be highly influential on later styles, including Renaissance as well as neoclassical architecture and even American architecture of the 19th and 20th century.
Archaic Greek sculpture. During this period, it was still heavily influenced by Egyptian sculpture as well as Assyrian techniques. Greek sculptures created stone friezes and reliefs, as well as statues that are made in stone, terracotta, and bronze, and even miniature works that are made in ivory and bone. The early style of freestanding daedalic sculpture are in 650 to 600, as exemplified by the works of Daedalus, Diponus, and Skylis, wherein it was dominated by two human stereotypes. The first one is the standing nude youth or the Kaurus, and the second one is the standing draped girl, Kauri. Archaic Greek painting. Since most vases and sculptures were painted, the growth of pottery and sculpture during the 7th century led automatically to more work for Greek painters. In addition, the walls of many temples, municipal buildings, and tombs were decorated with fresco painting, while their marble or wooden sculpture was colored with tempera or encaustic painting. Unfortunately, due to erosion, vandalism, and destruction, few original Greek paintings have survived from this period. All that remains are the few painted slabs of terracotta, the terracotta metopes from the temple of Apollo at Thermon in Aetolia, c. 630. Some wooden panels wherein it is the 4 pizza panels found in a cave in the northern Peloponnese, and murals such as the 7th century battle scene taken from the temple of Kalapudi near Thebes, and those excavated from underground tombs in Etruria. Classical period, c. 480 to 323 BCE. Victory over the Persians in 490 BCE and 479 BCE established Athens as the strongest of the city or the Greek city-states. Despite external threats, it would retain its leading cultural role for the next few centuries. Indeed, during the 5th century BCE, Athens witnessed a creative resurgence which would not only dominate future Roman art, but when rediscovered by Renaissance Europe 2,000 years later, would constitute an absolute artistic standard for another 4 centuries. All this despite the fact that most Greek paintings and sculptures have been destroyed. The main contribution of Greek classicism to fine art was undoubtedly its sculpture, in particular the canon of proportions, with its realization of the ideal human body, a concept which resonated so strongly with high Renaissance art 1,000 years later. Classical Greek pottery. During this era, ceramic art and thus vase painting experienced a progressive decline. Apart from this single innovation, classical Greek pottery declined significantly in both quality and artistic merit, and eventually became dependent on local Hellenistic schools. Classical Greek architecture. Like most Greek visual art, building design reached its apogee during the classical period as 2 main styles or orders of Greek architecture. The Doric and the Ionic came to define a timeless, harmonious, universal standard of architectural beauty. The Doric style was the more formal and austere, a style which predominated during the 4th and the 5th centuries, while the Ionic was more relaxed and somewhat decorative, a style which became more popular during the more easygoing Hellenistic era. Examples of classic Greek architecture include the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, 468 to 456, the Temple of Hephaestus, c. 449 BCE, the Temple of Basae, Arcadia, c. 430, which contained the first Corinthian capital, and many more. Classical Greek sculpture. In the history of sculpture, no period was more productive than the 150 years between 480 to 330 BCE. As far as plastic art is concerned, there may be subdivided into early classical Greek sculpture from 480 to 450, high classical Greek sculpture from 450 to 400, and the late classical Greek sculpture from 400 to 323. During the era as a whole, there was a huge improvement in the technical ability of Greek sculptures to depict the human body in a naturalistic rather than rigid posture. Anatomy became more accurate as a result. Statues started to look more true to life. Also, bronze became the main medium for freestanding works due to its ability to maintain its shape, which permitted the sculpting of even more natural-looking poses. Subjects were broadened to include the full panoply of gods and goddesses, along with minor divinities, an extensive range of mythological narratives, and diverse selection of athletes. Other specific developments include the introduction of a Platonic canon of proportions to create an idealized human figure, and the invention of contrapposta. During the late classical era, the first respectable female nudes appeared. Classical Greek painting. Classical Greek painting reveals a grasp of linear perspective and naturalist representation, which will remain unsurpassed until the Italian High Renaissance. Apart from vase painting, all types of painting flourished during the classical period. According to authors like Pliny, 23 to 79 CE, or Pausanias, active 143 to 176 CE. The highest form was panel painting, done in encaustic and tempera. Subjects included figurative scenes, portraits, and still lifes, and exhibitions, for instance, at Athens and Delphi, were relatively common. Alas, due to the perishable nature of these panels along the centuries of looting and vandalism, not a single Greek classical panel painting of any quality has survived, nor any Roman copy. Fresco painting was a common method of mural decoration in temples, public buildings, houses, and tombs, but these larger artworks generally had a lower reputation than panel paintings. The painting of stone, terracotta, and wood sculpture was another specialist technique mastered by Greek artists. Stone sculptures were typically painted in bold colors, though usually only those parts of the statue which depicted clothing and hair were colored, while the skin was left in the natural stone color. But on occasion, the entire sculpture was painted. Sculpture painting was viewed in a distinctive art, an early type of mixed media rather than merely a sculptural enhancement. In addition to paint, the statue might also be adorned by precious materials. The most famous 5th century classical Greek painters included Apollodorus, noted for his skiagraphia, a primitive type of chiaroscuro, his pupil, the great Zeuxis of Heraclea, noted for his easel paintings of Trompe Io, as well as Agatharchus, the first to have used graphical perspective on a large scale. Parrhasius, known for his drawing and his picture of Theseus in the capital of Rome. And Temarete, one of the greatest female Greek painters, noted for a panel painting at Ephesus of the goddess Diana. During the late classical period from 400 to 323 BCE, which saw the flourishing of the Macedonian Empire under Philip II and his son Alexander the Great, Athens continued to be the dominant culture center of the mainland Greece. This was the high point of ancient Greek painting, with artists like the talented and influential Apelles of Kos, official painter to Philip II of Macedonia, and his son Alexander the Great, adding new techniques of highlighting, shading, and coloring.
Hellenism from 323 to 27 before Christ era. The period of Hellenistic art opens with the death of Alexander the Great and the incorporation of the Persian Empire into the Greek world. By this point, Hellenism had spread throughout the civilized world, and centers of Greek arts and culture included cities like Alexandria, Antioch, Pergamum, Miletus, as well as towns of the other settlements in Asia Minor, Anatolia, Egypt, Italy, Crete, Cyprus, Rhodes, and the other islands of Aegean. Greek culture was thus utterly dominant, but the sudden demise of Alexander triggered a rapid decline of Greek imperial power, as his massive empire was divided between three of his generals: Antigonus, who received Greece and Macedonia; Seleucus, who took over controlled Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and Persia; Ptolemy, who ruled Egypt. Paradoxically, therefore, this period is marked by massive Greek cultural influence, but weakening Greek power. By 27 before Christ era, Greece and its empire would be ruled from ancient Rome. But even then, the Romans would continue to revere and emulate Greek art for centuries. Hellenistic architecture. The division of the Greek Empire into separate entities, each with its own ruler and dynasty, created huge new opportunities for self-aggrandizement. In Asia Minor, a new capital city was built at Pergamum by the Attalids in Persia. The Seleucids evolved a form of Baroque-style building design in Egypt. The Ptolemaic dynasty constructed the lighthouse and library at Alexandria. Palatial architecture was revitalized and numerous municipal structures were built to boost the influence of local rulers. The temple architecture, however, experienced a major slump. From 300 BCE onwards, the Greek peripteral temple, single row of pillars on all sides, lost much of its importance. Indeed, except for some activity in the western half of Asia Minor temple, construction came to a virtual stop during the 3rd century, both in mainland Greece and in the nearby Greek colonies. Even monumental projects like Artemision at Sardis, at the Temple of Apollo at Didyma, near Miletus, made little progress. All this changed during the 2nd century, when temple building experienced something of a revival due partly to increased prosperity, partly to improvements made by the architect Hermogenes of Priene to the Ionic style of architecture, and partly to the cultural propaganda war waged for increased influence between the various Hellenistic kingdoms and between them and Rome. In the process, temple architecture was revived, and an extensive number of Greek temples, as well as small-scale structures, pseudo-peripterus and shrine Niskoi, were erected in southern Asia Minor, Egypt, and North Africa. As far as styles went, the restrained Doric style of temple architecture fell completely out of fashion, since Hellenism demanded the more flamboyant forms of Ionic and Corinthian orders. Admired by the Roman architect Vitruvius, 78 to 10 BCE, famous examples of Hellenistic architecture include the Great Theater, Ephesus, 3rd to 1st century, the Stoa at Attalus, 159 to 138, and the Clock House Tower of the Winds of Athens. Hellenistic sculpture. Hellenistic Greek sculpture continued the classical trend towards ever greater naturalism. Animals, as well as ordinary people of all ages, became acceptable subjects for sculpture, which was frequently commissioned by wealthy individuals or families to decorate their homes and gardens. Sculptors no longer felt obliged to portray men and women as ideals of beauty. In fact, the idealized classical serenity of the 5th and 4th century gave way to greater emotionalism, an intense realism, and an almost Baroque-like dramatization of subject matter. For a typical style of this form of plastic art, see Pergamon School of Hellenistic Sculpture, 241 to 133 BCE. As a result of the spread of Greek culture, Hellenization, there was also much greater demand from the newly established overseas Greek culture centers in Egypt, Syria, and Turkey for statues and reliefs of Greek gods, goddesses, and heroic figures for their temples and public areas. Thus, a large market developed in the production and export of Greek sculpture, leading to a fall in workmanship and creativity. Also, in their quest for greater expressionism, Greek sculptors resorted to more monumental works, a practice which found its ultimate expression in the Colossus of Rhodes, 220 BCE. Famous Greek sculpture of the period include the Furnace Bull, 2nd century, the Dying Bull by Epigonus, the Winged Victory of Samothrace, 1st and 2nd century BC. Hellenistic painting. The increased demand for Greek-style sculpture was mirrored by a similar increase in the popularity of Hellenistic Greek painting, which was taught and propagated in a number of separate schools, both on the mainland and in the islands. Regarding subject matter, classical favorites such as mythology and contemporary events were superseded by genre paintings, animal studies, still lifes, landscapes, and other similar subjects, largely in line with the decorative styles uncovered at Herculaneum and Pompeii, 1st century BCE and later, many of which are believed to be copies of Greek originals. Perhaps the greatest contribution of Hellenist painters was in portrait art, notably the Fayum mummy portraits, dating from the 1st century BCE onwards. These beautifully preserved panel paintings from the Coptic period, in all some 900 works, are the only significant body of art to have survived intact from Greek antiquity, found mostly around the Fayum basin in Egypt. These realistic facial portraits were attached to the funeral cloth itself, so as to cover the faces of mummified bodies. Artistically speaking, the images belongs to the Greek style of portraiture rather than any Egyptian tradition. See also Greek mural and panel painting legacy.
The Roman art history. The Romans originated in central Italy, influenced by other local Italian cultures, notably those of Etruria, but from the 5th century they came into contact with the Greeks, and from then onwards, the Roman Republic absorbed many aspects of first classical and then Hellenistic art. Although Rome was founded as far back as 750 BCE, it led a precarious existence of several centuries. Initially, it was ruled by Etruscan kings who commissioned a variety of Etruscan art, like for example murals, sculptures, and metalwork, and that is used for their tombs as well as their palaces, and to also celebrate their military victories. After the founding of the Roman Republic in 500 BCE, Etruscan influence waned, and from 300 BCE, as the Romans started coming into contact with the flourishing Greek cities of southern Italy and the eastern Mediterranean, they fell under the influence of Greek art, which is a process known as Hellenization. Soon, many Greek works of art were being taken to Rome as booty, and many Greek artists followed to pursue their careers under Roman patronage. However, the arts were still not a priority for Roman leaders who were more concerned about survival and military affairs. It wasn't until about 200 BCE, after it won the First Punic War against Hannibal and the Carthaginians, that Rome felt secure enough to develop its culture. Even then, the absence of an independent cultural tradition of its own meant that most ancient art of Rome imitated Greek works. Rome was unique among the powers of the ancient world in developing only a limited artistic language of its own. Now let's move on to the characteristics of the Roman art. First is, their art style was built on a foundation of Greek with elements of Etruscans, Egyptians, and Persians, but the art of the Roman Empire was heavily influenced by the Etruscans, which are Rome's predecessors on the Italian mainland, and by the Hellenic influences of the Greeks. Second is, they are known for their architecture and engineering rather than art, such as painting, pottery, and sculpture. And that is because Romans are not directly imitated and copied Greek artistic ideas. Greek artists were brought to Rome and relied upon to design and repair monumental buildings. And also they have strong desire for realism, and we can see that in their portraits, how they decorate public buildings and the homes of wealthy Romans.
There are four major Roman art forms. It includes architecture, painting, sculpture, and mosaic work. Architecture. Rome's greatest contribution to the history of art is undoubtedly to be found in the field of architectural design. Roman architecture during the age of the Republic discovered the round temple and the curved arch. But after the turn of the millennium, Roman architects and engineers developed techniques for urban building on a massive scale. The erection of the monumental structures like Pantheon and Colosseum would have been impossible without the Rome's development of the arch and the dome, as well as the mastery of strong and low-cost materials like concrete and bricks. The Romans didn't invent the arch. It was known but not much used in Greek architecture, but they were the first to master and use the multiple arcs or vaults. The Romans also made frequent use of the semicircular arch, typically without resorting to the mortar, relying instead on the precision of their stonework. A further architectural development was the dome, or also known as the vaulted ceiling, which made possible the construction and roofing of a large open areas inside buildings like Hadrian's Pantheon, the Basilica of Constantine, as well as the numerous other temples and basilicas, since far fewer columns were needed to support the weight of the dome roof. The use of domes went hand in hand with the extensive use of concrete, a combination sometimes referred to as the Roman architectural revolution. But flagship buildings with domes were far from being the only architectural masterpieces built by ancient Rome. Just as important was the five-story apartment building known as an insula, which accommodated thousands of citizens. Painting. The Romans drew artistic inspiration from a number of subjects. This includes animals, still lifes, portraits, and mythological creatures. The Romans, in contrast to the Greeks, incorporated a great deal of perspective and paid attention to the surface textures, shading, and spatial awareness in their art. Portraits declined in popularity as the Roman civilization continued. This was one of Pliny's main criticism of Roman art, claiming that portraits were used to transmit through the ages of accurate likenesses of people has entirely gone out. Romans would often be buried with a portrait. These portraits would illustrate the person's head in quite some detail, accompanied by a colorless background. During the 3rd century BC, triumphal paintings began to become popular. They would depict military victories and conquered enemies' cities and regions. During this period, the Romans also painted decorative maps in order to show the major location of the particular campaign. These paintings would be surrounded in a gold and ivory frames. Triumphal scenes can also be seen everywhere, most evidently on Trajan's column, where there are many images of Roman battles during the Dacian Wars. The oldest painting found in the Rome was found in a tomb in Esquiline Hill. It describes a historical battle, painted on a plain background in 4 enlarged segments. The painting details both Marcus Fannius and Marcus Fabius. The image illustrates a city surrounded by a fortified walls, in front of which there is a large warrior surrounded by soldiers with short tunics and armed with spears. The lower segment depicts a battle scene between the Romans and the Samnites. The image is most likely referred to the Second Samnite War in 326 BC. Sculptures. The Romans used many materials when creating sculptures. This includes stone, metals, and glass. However, as metals such as bronze were in high demand, many of them were melted down to be reused. That's why today, the only remaining sculptures were made using marble. Towards the middle of the 1st century AD, Roman art began to become more realistic, with emphasis being put on optical effects and facial features. Beyond the 2nd century AD, Roman art became more impressionist, utilizing abstract forms and effect of light. Sculptures throughout the empire began to become monumentally large, with statues of emperors and gods being immortalized in enormous bronze statues. Examples of this includes the statue of Marcus Aurelius on horseback and the even larger statue of Constantine I, both located in Rome. As Roman art developed further, sculptures began to lack proportions, with heads being enlarged. This was a distinct feature illustrating the influence of Eastern art.
Traditional Roman sculpture divided into 5 categories: portraiture, historical relief, funeral relief, sarcophagi, and copies of ancient Greek sculpture. Portraiture. These works of marble and occasionally bronze sculpture were another important Roman contribution to the art of antiquity. Effigies of Roman leaders had been displayed in public places for centuries. But with the onset of empire in the late 1st century before Christ era, marble portrait busts and statues of the emperor, which were copied en masse and sent to all parts of the Roman world, serve an important function in reminding people of Rome's reach. They also serve an important unifying force. Historical relief. Rome didn't invent relief sculpture. Stone Age man did, nor was there any particular genius in the skill of its carvers and stone masons. Both the reliefs of the Parthenon 447 to 422 before Christ era and the frieze of the Parthegamon altar of Zeus c. 166 to 154 before Christ era outshone anything created in Italy. What Rome did was to inject the genre with a new set of aesthetics, a new purpose, namely to make history. The Greeks adopted the more cultured approach of recording their history more obliquely, using scenes from mythology. The Romans were far more down to earth. They sculptured their history as it happened, warts and all. Funeral reliefs. Funerary reliefs in ancient Rome were used to decorate the outside of tombs, were nearly always accompanied by epitaph inscriptions. Scenes carved into the reliefs traditionally included images that had a personal connection to the deceased. Sarcophagi. As Rome turned from cremation to burial at the end of the 1st century CE, stone coffins known as sarcophagi were much in demand, the 3 most common types being Metropolitan Roman, made in Rome, Attic style, made in Athens, and Asiatic, made in the Commune Phrygia, towards the end of the Roman Empire. Sarcophagi became an important medium for Christian Rome art. copies of ancient Greek sculpture. Although the wholesale replication of Greek statues indicated a hesitancy and lack of creativity on the part of Roman artists, the history of art could not be more grateful to them for their efforts. Indeed, it is fair to say that one of the greatest contributions of Rome to history of art lies in its replication of original Greek statues, 99% of which have disappeared. Without Roman copies of the originals, Greek art would never have received the appreciation it deserves in Renaissance art, and thus Western art in general might have taken a different course.
Mosaic work. A mosaic is a piece of art created by assembling small pieces of colored glass, ceramic, stone, or other materials into an image. Mosaics became a very popular art form during the time of the Roman Empire, although they were used in Italy both before and after this period. Roman mosaics appeared on floor in houses as early as the 2nd century BCE. Romans used mosaics to decorate floors and walls in homes and temples. They were a complex and beautiful art that often indicated the importance of a place or the wealth of a homeowner. Roman mosaics, especially floor mosaics, are found all across what was once the Roman Empire, which indicates how popular the art form was back then.
Cultural inferiority complex. Roman architecture and engineering was never less than bold, but its painting and sculpture was based on Greek traditions and also on art forms developed on its vassal states, like Egypt and ancient Persia. To put it in another way, despite their spectacular military triumphs, the Romans had an inferiority complex in the face of Greek artistic achievement. Their ultra-pragmatic response was to recycle Greek sculpture at every opportunity. Greek poses reworked with Roman clothes and accessories were pressed into service to reinforce Roman power. Heroic Greek statues were even supplied headless to enable the buyer to fit his own portrait head. An example is the equestrian bronze statue of Emperor Marcus Aurelius, c. 175 CE, whose stance is reworked from Greek statue of Doryphorus, 440 before Christ era. The reason for Rome's cultural inferiority complex remains unclear. Some classical scholars have pointed to the pragmatic Roman temperament, others to the overriding Roman need for territorial security against the waves of marauding tribes from Eastern and Central Europe, and the consequent low priority accorded to the art and culture. To which might we add that judging by the narrowness of Celtic art, 500 BCE to 100 CE, Roman artists weren't doing too badly. Moreover, we should note that cities in ancient Rome were less provincial and far more powerful than Greek city-states, so that its art invariably played a more functional role, not least because Roman culture was actually a melange of different beliefs and customs, all of which had to be accommodated. Thus, for example, art quickly became something of a status symbol, something to enhance the buyer's home and social position, and since most Romans recognized the intrinsic value of Greek artistry, buyers wanted to Greek styles work.